So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds. This week we're really delighted to be joined by two special guests. First, we've got Peter Klepp from Brussels Report. Hello.
Hi.
And delighted to be joined by Tamas Orban of the European Conservative. Welcome.
Hi.
Before we kick off, I do need to remind our viewers, if you're watching us for the first time or if you're a returning viewer, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on updates, and also hit the like button. And if you're enjoying what we're saying, you can ring the notifications bell and also leave us a comment. Tell us how you're enjoying the podcast or topics that you think you'd like us to cover next. So this week on the podcast, we want to dig into three quite important topics that have happened over the course of the week. First off, we're going to be looking at the big assembly of Patriots that happened over the weekend in Madrid, featuring all of the big names from the Patriots for Europe. We're second going to look at the consequences of the European Green Deal and Europe's ongoing economic problems. Then we're going to take a look at JD Vance's trip to Paris and the stern words that he had for European leaders on AI. So coming first to this topic, about the Patriots, big conference for the Patriots for Europe in Madrid. All of the kind of key names and stars were there from representing Patriots for Europe. We wanted to talk about this, and Tamas was there, so I'm going to get him to give us his views on what it was kind of like. But I guess one of the things that's really interesting about it is that it seems to me that this is not just a kind of a grouping of coincidence, or it's not just like an ordinary grouping of MEPs. There's maybe a almost ideological agenda that unites them as well. But Tamas, what was your impressions from the trip? Was it good fun? What was the energy like?
Well, first of all, the energy, it was very different than I first expected. Last year I went to the ID Group, the Identity and Democracy Group's annual summit. It was in Florence. It's relevant because in its core, the Patriots are made up of like maybe 3/4 of its members or former members of the ID Group, even though two of the three founders were newcomers. Fidesz and the Czechs. But that summit was completely different in its energy and its momentum than what we saw now in Madrid. This truly felt like a new era began or this whole national conservative movement in Europe has stepped onto a new stage in a new pace. Well, it was very good choice to organize it in Madrid, of course, with lots of Spanish audience, bringing with all that passion, all that energy with them. When Santiago Abascal, the leader of Vox, who were hosting the summit, when he and all the others like Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Viktor Orban, Matteo Salvini, when they stepped onto the stage, the crowd just erupted. It was really not that unexpected, but it was something that I've never seen in European politics before. It was sort of like a bit Trumpian in that way, like reminiscent of the biggest Trump rallies, in the campaign periods. So yeah, I felt like I've been transported into a different era in EU politics. It was good to see. Of course, reality is not what you see in a rally. That was a moment in time, but it is, I think, indicative of something that's moving in Europe.
And Peter, this is, I guess, the point I wanted your thoughts on, because you've been following European politics for quite a while. It seems that previous groupings of conservative, patriotic, Eurosceptic to some degree forces have always been kind of alliances of convenience in some way, and there hasn't necessarily been a lot of kind of shared movement or ideology to those forces assembled under different banners, be it the ID Group or the ECR or whatever. Is there something different, do you think, about the Patriots?
Yeah, I do think that at the moment we do see a more or less ideologically coherent movement of national conservatism in Europe. And this is gaining traction, not just because of the success of Trump in the United States. This has definitely emboldened the movement in Europe as well, but also basically because events on the ground. I mean, ordinary Europeans I would say, becoming more right-wing in the sense that they are sick and tired of the migration chaos. Also, when it comes to things like security, like high taxes, these are important topics that have become a lot more mainstream. A few years ago, it was politically incorrect to criticize climate policies. Now, I think we're moving to a new consensus where it's very difficult to claim that these kind of policies are sane in any way. The same with migration. It's becoming very difficult to say, look, migration is actually not such an issue, and the problem is that Europeans are not tolerant enough for newcomers. That used to be sort of the old consensus. Now, I think there's rightly a realization that we have a big problem. There's many people that are not well integrated, even if we had a lot less illegal migration into Europe in 24 as compared to before. Still, I think 250,000 people walked into Europe illegally, and that's obviously a very big problem. Now, whether these parties will be able to capitalize on that in practice and change government policy, I think the sad truth is, so far they have failed to do that. Orban in Hungary has not been able, I think, to change much at the EU level, or even when it comes to immigration. People have been able to continue to travel through Hungary. We have Salvini in Italy. I don't really see any big changes there, to be honest. Geert Wilders in the Netherlands is failing so far. He's clearly very frustrated. He just threatened to blow up the Dutch government again. Le Pen is holding the balance of power in France now. That is interesting. Will it lead to actual policy change? Still early days, I think. So we'll have to see whether all of this will translate in actual changes on the ground.
Yeah. And Tamas, what we at the event in Madrid, you got, at some level it's slightly odd because you've got all of these different people speaking different languages, maybe with or without translation. But I just want to get a feel from you. What were the kind of conversations in the bar like? Who was there? What were the elements of this kind of ideological coherence, if there is some, to the kind of patriotic movement in European politics?
Ideology, I mean, you asked for ideology. I think it's there was a shared motive in many of the leaders' speeches, which was that we may be different and we may be a dozen different parties with very country-specific agendas. But what connects us, that was Marine Le Pen said, what connects us is the love for our nations. And, well, it's just a pretty way to say that we all identify the same problems coming from the same source, which is Brussels, which may impact us differently, but we can unite in a way how we counter these threats. Also, yeah, I think you're right that in the past, the national conservative scene in Europe was more fragmented. And I think it's partly because this saturation of information or the spread of information on social media, which sort of accelerated this kind of unity along certain topics that Peter just mentioned. You know, we have migration, we have the Green Deal, we have sovereignty, we have free speech. Very limited, small number of issues that can be shared, can be easily understood, can be easily translated to national context. Everybody can relate to, and therefore easily unite or rally around, right? And these were all the topics that were discussed during the summit, on the sidelines of the summit. Basically, that look, we've been dealing with all these issues. Oh, you've been dealing with these issues in your countries this way. Well, we have our experiences the same. We have the NGOs, we have free speech, we have activist judiciary. They've been acting the same in all these countries. Now we have Trump, who's blowing up this giant scandal with USAID and everything, we can more easily relate to each other and push back against these things together. Yeah, that was basically the sense of it.
Yeah, and Peter, you also alluded to the kind of Trump effect, if you like. How do you think that's coalesced or shaken up the kind of patriotic mood in European politics?
Well, if you look into it, the Trump administration is actually, I think, doing a service for Europeans. Yes, there are the threats to tariffs, and let's hope that they ultimately do not realize if Europeans make concessions to Trump. We don't know, right? But many of the criticism coming from America is that European policies are endangering free speech. Well, that's a good thing for Europeans, I would say. Climate policies are not desired, and environmental burdens, environmental protectionism that the European Union is exporting, due diligence obligations that they are imposing on American trading partners, on companies. This is causing great concern in the United States. So again, that's another demand of the Trump administration that I think is ultimately positive for Europe. If we could get rid of that over-regulation. I mean, there's a number of other things. The EU is coming up with its climate tariff, believe it or not. It's called CBAM, and the idea is that, well, the rest of the world is not copying our suicidal climate policies. This is so unfair. So we will impose customs duties on imports from the rest of the world.
A kind of green protectionism in a way.
It's green protectionism, and everybody is, I think, rightly criticizing Trump for being, for coming up with some protectionist measures. But then nobody is talking about how the European Union has been coming up with a protectionist regulation and protectionist new tariffs in recent years that are not just challenged by the United States, but also, for example, India is greatly concerned by this. And this is at the time when the EU has already been failing to conclude new trade deals. Now, maybe I'm too optimistic about Trump, but maybe we end up in a scenario where there's no new American tariffs, or not a lot, but a lot of concessions from trading partners. And at least when you look at how Trump has been dealing with Colombia, Mexico, Canada, at least his threats have been suspended after these countries made concessions. So if the EU would make some concessions that are ultimately good for Europeans, and this ends up in a situation with no or almost no new American tariffs, I think that's win-win.
So moving on, and we've begun to touch on it already. The kind of one of the cornerstone policies of the EU for many years has been the move towards a Green Deal, and we've talked before on this podcast about whether they're trying to rebrand it, whether they're rowing back on it. But it seems over the last week or two, there's been at least a real rhetorical shift in how they talk about some of these policies. Today, the Commission was presenting the work program in the European Parliament. But Peter, if I can ask you, because this is something you follow very closely, do you think there's any substance to this attempt to rebrand the Green Deal? Putting Trump aside to 1 second, but what, in the eyes of European leaders, do you see any chance that there's going to be a kind of serious rethink on green policies?
Well, in the rhetorics, there's some changes in. Now they want to have a clean and industrial deal. It's no longer just a climate deal. But when you look into it, you don't hear them proposing to slash some of these Green Deal policies that they have been implementing. The energy price is very high in Europe. It's 4 or 5 times as high when you look at the gas price as compared to the American gas price. Now, the European Union's climate taxation system, ETS, this alone is higher than the total American gas price. So at the moment when we have European chemical industry badly suffering, you would expect at least somebody to say, well, maybe we should abolish this European climate taxation, because this was introduced in 2005. And if you look at CO2 emission since 2005, in America, it has been falling a lot more than in Europe. So whatever you think of this ETS, climate taxation, it's clearly not, the only method to reduce CO2 emission if that is your goal. And clearly it is badly eroding the competitiveness of European industry, apart from the fact that, of course, fracking is banned in Europe. Shale is banned. Well, I mean, we're happy to import it from America at very high prices, but it's illegal over here. So but this is, of course, also a national issue. So, I mean, none of that is featuring in any of the policies, let alone the statements of the European Commission or even national leaders. To be fair. So I think we're still very much at the beginning of the deconstruction of the whole, green, suicidal economic policy framework. We're still at the beginning, I'm afraid. And what's worrying is that in her working program, von der Leyen mentions that she actually wants to sharpen up European Union climate policies. There is some kind of a climate target to be reached in 2040, and she wants that to become binding, whatever that means. That's a different discussion. But this is a concession she made to the Greens in order to get the Green support in the European Parliament for her investiture vote. But it just shows that, I mean, she is the problem. And she hasn't changed, and she's basically actively obstructing any, together with her whole administration, of course, she's actively obstructing any real attempts to make Europe competitive again.
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking if this rebranding has any meaningful effect, I mean, it really shows you how much, not just the fact that politically in the European Parliament, when the Patriots just recently called for this conservative alliance, or whatever you would call, between all the, at least nominally, right-wing parties, right?
Nominally is always the most important.
Oh, yes. So ECR, ESN, and the EPP, of course, because they needed the EPP for anything to succeed. They called for this alliance to suspend, to pause the Green Deal and to reevaluate it, to see what parts are actually make sense to keep, what parts need to be reworked or thrown out. Because that was partly in reply to these revelations in the Dutch media that the Commission possibly illegally used EU taxpayer funds to lobby lawmakers, citizens, governments to adopt the Green Deal in the first place, right? So it would make sense to put a pause on it. And so the EPP, which is von der Leyen's party, the biggest party controlling all the institutions, they said that no, we insist on keeping the Green Deal as it is. So this is basically an admittance that the clean industrial deal in its core will keep everything that makes the Green Deal, right? It's not gonna reform it in any meaningful way.
Yeah. And Peter, one of the things that they've been laying out, which is they've trying to kind of bundle everything together and saying that they're rethinking the whole economic picture. They've announced that they're going to be simplifying regulations, that they're going to be getting rid. It was really interesting to know that, I mean, today they were presenting, as we're recording this, they were presenting this program, and the details came out. They were even planning to scrap some laws, which for the EU is basically unheard of, to reduce laws. But then it turns out that, and they'd only managed to identify 4. Which wasn't very encouraging to begin with. And then the only 4 that they managed to identify were ones that had already been superseded by additional, even more onerous legislation anyway. So does that really show that whatever they talk about in terms of increasing competitiveness, reducing the burden of red tape, they're not necessarily serious about it?
Absolutely. And in the past, we had a number of rounds of better regulation. Sometimes this amounted to a little bit. Most of the time, it amounted to nothing. And you may recall that the European Commissioner under Juncker, who was responsible for better regulation, was Frans Timmermans, who became the great zealot in favor of the Green Deal in 2019. So we're not just talking about the institution that sort of is, not exactly in favor of better regulation when it comes to it. We're talking about the politician that was embodying the drive to better regulation, that basically, at the first occasion, throw everything away. So I think ultimately the best guarantee against European overregulation is to change the EU treaties and to make sure that there's only one procedure to agree new EU regulation, and that is with complete unanimity on every single issue. And personally, I would also scrap the European Parliament. It's been tried. It's not a crazy idea to have a directly elected assembly to control the European Union machine, but I think we have to be honest and say it doesn't work. They don't really hold the EU machine into account. They never stop, they never refuse discharge to EU spending whenever that EU spending is being criticized by the European Court of Auditors. Every time they want regulation to be more intrusive. I mean, there's no real link with public opinion also. Maybe we should go back to the old system where you had, let's say, the EU committees of national parliaments that would be tasked with holding the EU machine to account. I would be open to try that. But also, I think we must conclude after so many years that the European Parliament plays a very negative role when it comes to, making sure the European Union stays in line, that it remains true to its original tasks of opening up trade both within Europe and with the rest of the world. The EU is further and further away from that goal. Now it's no longer even bothered by state aid, national state aid. Governments in Europe, they can just hand out subsidies like crazy. This is completely undermining fair competition in the EU. The one time when the European Commission takes action against this is when they see the Irish government concluding some kind of a tax ruling with an American big tech company.
Yeah.
Then suddenly they become interested in policing the ban on state aid, and then they look at these gray zones. Okay, is this state aid? Apple claims it was not state aid because this arrangement was open to all companies, it claimed. The EU did not. Well, maybe you can make a case for it, but it doesn't make any sense that they are so obsessed with going after American big tech and acting as sort of the tax office for American big companies, while completely ignoring the core business of the EU. And yeah, this is all related to each other. Overregulation. They don't care about making sure it becomes easier to buy a car in another European country. This could be great. Or to opening up the insurance market, to make it cheaper to have an insurance. They don't even try that anymore. The only thing they do is to justify every harmonization with, we have to do that in order to open up the EU market, but then they only care about agreeing these harmonized regulations. They don't really care about national protectionism, because national protectionism is on the rise in recent years in Europe, and the European Commission has completely abandoned any attempt, I think, to do something about that.
Yeah, and Tamas, I mean, so Peter was talking about the often toothless role of the Parliament, and I was reminded of this kind of saga towards the end of or recently, when there was a much trumpeted moment when they said the EPP said we're finally going to take firm action against some of these crazy climate laws, and and the deforestation regulation had come back to the Parliament because it needed to be postponed because it was clearly impossible to actually implement. And this much heralded moment where the EPP had finally seen sense about environmental legislation resulted in them just adding a year's delay to the legislation. And I wanted to pick up on this, Thomas, because does this show that in many ways that it still remains the case that the key block on having a more sensible conversation, whether it be about climate policy or generally competitive economic policy, remains the centre-right EPP?
Oh, definitely. I mean, everything in this parliament, at least for now, I mean, in most of its terms, but everything hinges on where the EPP stands, because it really is in the middle. I mean, it's leaning left, I think, in most of the cases. I think it was Peter who said last time we talked that during the last 5 years term, the EPP voted 92% of the times together with the socialists and the liberals. So you can't really make the argument that they are a right-wing party. But that's not the point I want to make. The point is that it's more often than not they, and I think more than other parties, they think about legislation and how they vote in terms of strategy and how to position themselves in the parliament. They don't. I don't really see they following a consistent program or ideology or anything. They're always tied by their need to stay on top. They need to stay in power and basically rule what's happening in the parliament. And for that, they always need their consistent coalition partners, which in, I don't know, 9 times out of 10 are the socialists and liberals and sometimes the Greens, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, just an hour ago, I was following the Strasbourg plenary live, and they just now, an hour ago, had a debate about the biggest threat to European competitiveness, according to the left, is the cooperation between the center right, the EPP, and the far right, which is everybody else on the right. So that's the biggest threat to European competitiveness, according to the socialists who submitted this report, and they call for a resolution. And so this really shows that the EPP is in kind of a trap, but I think they set it up for themselves. So it's at the minute they even consider um, uh, making the tiniest concessions to the conservatives, which their own voters really expect them to do, they are accused of, joining the far right, destroying the EU, destroying democracy, undermining EU values, and all hell breaks loose. But they put themselves into this position. So what the EPP, keynote speaker had to say about all this in the parliament right now, that no, we would never collaborate again with the AfD. Of course, this was in reply to the migration vote in Germany. We would never collaborate with them again. Please stop bashing us. We're the good guys. We're with you. So yeah, the minute they make just the first step to actually represent their voters and what people really want, according to polls, according to election and everything you see now, because 60%, 68% or something like that in Germany strongly supports the idea of AfD and CDU making joint legislation together, or joining in parliament for specific legislations, right? So this is not a fringe position, but in Brussels, this is a betrayal of democracy and European values, and they are immediately forced to come back on it. So if you don't have strong values and strong positions, and if you cannot tell your coalition partners, may then be on the left or right, that look, we now stand on this because we represent our voters, the people. If you don't have the spine to do that, then no wonder that you can get from one to the other.
Yeah, and then one good example I want to cite is the extension of the European Union's climate tax from 2007 on. So what will happen is that diesel and heating your house on gas, which are very common things in continental Europe, will be taxed. And this will cost families at least a few €100 extra per year. Now, you would think this is like an open goal. If you're CDU, if you're just German Christian Democrats, the leader Merz has openly been criticizing climate policies. There is a coalition led by the Czech Republic that says, look, I mean, this is crazy. This is going to hurt families. France is sympathetic to it, a number of other countries as well. So it's completely, let's say, mainstream to put question marks with that. Now, Peter Liese, the CDU MEP who is responsible for that topic in the European Parliament, he said, no, that's absolutely the wrong way to go. we have to. His solution is that we need to compensate people that are not wealthy enough to afford this with taxpayers' money from some new social climate fund. I mean, this is not even center left anymore. This is a far left stance. You can agree with it or not, but this is absolute, for me, is far outside of the mainstream. And this person, Mr. Lise, has been reappointed how many times to the European Parliament by his party? Because effectively, that's what it is. They put this person on the list, and then he's certain to be re-elected. And that's just one good case that shows how completely out of touch. And you don't hear Merz then overruling him or something, say this is not party policy. I mean, so these kind of extreme stances are being taken by German Christian Democrats that are indeed strongly allying with not even the center left, with the Greens in the European Parliament. This is very worrying, I think. Yeah.
And coming on to our last topic for the day, JD Vance was in Paris for a big AI summit. It gave Emmanuel Macron his favorite opportunity, which is the opportunity for grandstanding. But aside from Macron getting a little bit of the limelight, what I think most interesting for us to discuss was the fact that JD Vance came to Europe, a little bit like you were saying earlier in terms of asking for Europe to reduce the regulatory burden. But on this particular topic on AI, it seems that whatever you think about the Trump administration in general, JD Vance has got a real point here, because this is one area where it's obvious that Europe is really far behind the rest of the world on. And also, Europe has been passing legislation specifically to make it harder to start AI companies or profit from them. Tamas, what did you make of JD Vance's speech and his call?
It was, I think Vance really came here with this idea in mind that he needs to, I think how to say this? So I think Vance is consciously building his resume for an eventual presidential campaign, right?
Yeah.
I think he would make great US president in 4 years' time. But yeah, what was interesting is him kind of very directly putting the EU in its place while von der Leyen was sitting next to him, like 5 meters on the same stage. Yeah, she looked visibly uncomfortable listening to that speech, because Vance spent half of his speech berating the EU in one way or another. Specifically, I think it was overregulation, which is obviously a big no if you want to foster an innovative AI environment. But he also mentioned deindustrialization and energy policy, which is very important because AI needs a lot of power. And he said many of our friends in Europe are chasing away reliable and cheap power. It was obviously meant mostly, I think, nuclear, and Germany is a great example of that. And then, which isn't directly related to AI, but could be made related in the future very easily, it's the DSA and other digital regulations in the EU, which Vance spent quite a bit of time on, and basically telling von der Leyen that Trump's America cannot and will not tolerate the EU basically threatening or restricting US companies' ability to ensure free speech on their platforms. Because the Digital Services Act, the DSA, is under that, platforms who are not
compliant,
who are not complying with basically misinformation censorship laws could be fined to, I think, 6% to their annual global turnover, which is huge, or could even be temporarily suspended in the entire EU. That's something obviously unacceptable for America. But Vance also said that the Trump administration will ensure that no American AI will be ideologically biased,
Yeah.
which is, I think it's a great point. But what's more important, that no American AI will be used by other foreign governments, any. It could be EU, could be China, could be whatever, to enhance its ideological online censorship or authoritarian censorship online.
Yeah. And Peter, this was in many ways a kind of slam dunk opportunity for JD Vance, because I remember when the EU passed the AI Act, and it was hilarious because they specifically said, we're the first kind of group, or the first place in the world to pass an AI Act. And you thought it'd been nice if they were the first place in the world to have an AI company, but that was like beyond them. So instead they could pass an act rather than having a company. But these points that Vance was making are ones we can hope to hold the EU to account on, right?
It's incredible. And at the time, none other than the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he said it's probably not such a good idea to have regulation of a sector that you're not actually developing. And I thought, yeah, exactly. This is precisely the right messaging, Emmanuel. But then 2 months later, he just signed off. His government just signed off on the AI Act. And this is puzzling because if you talk to AI experts, they predict that this will hold European AI innovation back. But at the heart of this is the EU's idea that it is a regulatory superpower. And that it can affect regulations in the whole world simply because of the importance of the EU market. Now, this is true for certain segments of the economy, but obviously not for AI. At least most experts think that the AI Act will not be voluntarily taken over by other parts of the world. You mentioned the deforestation law earlier. There is also the due diligence regulation. So there's in recent years there's a series of regulations that have been decided at the EU level, and that ultimately stem from that idea. We're a regulatory superpower. We're gonna not just regulate the economy in order to make sure things happen orderly within our jurisdiction. No, we're gonna issue regulations by trying to shape what happens in the rest of the world. And then deforestation is a good example. The first to complain about this were Malaysia, because they have a lot of palm oil exports. Now, according to NGOs, they have a lot less deforestation thanks to their own domestic standards that are pretty tough, actually. So they said, okay, this is not fair because you're trying to impose different bureaucracy, the different kinds of bureaucracy on us, even if we've actually been doing very well. Then the protest has spread to Brazil, the United States, the Biden administration, and now in America, the protest is against this whole series of European Union regulations, the AI Act also included. And in his criticism, Vance, he also mentioned, interestingly, GDPR.
Yeah.
I remember when everybody in Brussels was very proud on GDPR, and they were so proud that Tim Cook already, then the CEO of Apple, had been praising the EU for coming up with such.
Yeah, and now the GDPR along with the bottle caps is basically the only thing that Europe is really known for.
And it was cited by Mario Draghi as an example of EU underperformance. According to Draghi, with this regulation, quote unquote, he said, we are killing our companies. So he didn't hold back. That's Mario Draghi, a very mainstream figure. He had a figure showing that I think 15% of the profit of SME IT startups are harmed by GDPR. And Vance was basically just repeating that. If you looked at von der Leyen, it's like she was looking at him as if it was the first time in her life that she was confronted with that.
With the reality.
Perspective.
Yeah.
Her commission also doesn't want to tackle GDPR, by the way. They just completely ignored whatever Draghi said about that. So
going to bring it to a close there. But thanks for watching the MCC Brussels podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you hit subscribe, like, leave us a comment about things you might want us to discuss in the future. And also do make sure to check out both European Conservative for Tamas and Brussels Report for Peter. But to both of you, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.